Thank you, Mr. President. I want to look at paragraph 496 of the Militich brief, page 215, where it states that when General Militich went to Belgrade on 7 July 1995, the most he could have known was that the Drina Corps was to separate the Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves. That separation, which didn't involve taking the enclaves, didn't involve deporting the population. General Militich could therefore not have known that the Muslim population would take refuge en masse in Potočari. Since he could not have known that the Muslim population was going to take refuge in Potočari, he could not have known that various criminal acts would take place. Obviously, from our position during trial and in our brief, we are not contesting in any real way General Militich's quasi-alibi of being in Belgrade from the 7th through the 11th. Let's assume that it's been proven, just for the sake of argument. When General Militich left for Belgrade, this is what he knew. He knew that the VRS had Zeleni Jadar by blasting the Dutch out of it on June 3rd, taking over that OP Echo. He knew that the Krvaja 95 attack was underway. He knew that the Krvaja 95 attack plan called for splitting and shrinking the enclaves, which would recreate the humanitarian disaster which he all too well knew. And that in turn would create the conditions for the elimination of the enclaves, which is explicitly called for in that Krvaja 95 plan. He knew when he left for Belgrade that Krvaja 95, by its own words, was planned to implement directives 7 and 7.1, both of which he drafted. He knew Dutch Bat was weakened. He knew the population was starving and miserable. That's what he knew before he even left. And let's assume, again for the sake of argument, Your Honors, that General Militich had no contact whatsoever with the command post while he's on leave from 7 to 11 July. And I think everything that we have come to know about General Militich, his work ethic, dedication to his job, to his function, to the war effort, and with the communications that were available by the defense case's own testimony between the command post and Belgrade, tells us that, of course, General Militich remained in contact with the command post when he was on leave. But in any event, for the sake of argument, what's the first thing that's going to happen when he gets back to the command post on 11 July? He's going to report to the most senior general there. That's General Guerrero. Just like General Milovanovic did when he returned on the 19th. And he is duty-bound to receive a full report. If he hasn't heard already from watching the news, he's going to hear about Mladic being in Srebrenica, the Serbian flag on the church, And he's going to know that they've got this massive operation underway. Monumental mobilization of resources, buses, trucks, and fuel, one of the most strategic of all assets. Of course, he's going to know about these kinds of demands. The Miletich brief at page 211, paragraph 489, asserts that, quote, while General Mladic deployed officers in Potočari, including some who belonged to the main staff, General Miletich was in Crna Rijeka and was carrying out his usual work without being involved in the events in Srebrenica and or in Potočari. The prosecution's position in the evidence has shown that General Miletich could not properly be doing his job and not be involved and knowledgeable of those unfolding situations and the incredible demands that were being placed on the resources of the VRS during that period of time. Of course, he's receiving information. And of course, he's forwarding that to President Karadzic. And remember what Colonel Turkula said. He, at least, always expected that President Karadzic would read those reports. These were important documents containing important information. And on the subject of fuel, I want to note at page 137, paragraph 315, the brief from Miletich makes the assertion that UNPROFOR, in fact, had 30,000 liters of fuel on its own premises during this operation, and cites the testimony of Colonel Trisic from the Bratunac Brigade. That ignores completely Colonel Franken's testimony at transcript 2492 to 2493 and at 2568 to 2570. On cross-examination, I add, that the VRS advanced the fuel for the transportations to the UN because, as the evidence has overwhelmingly established, the Dutch didn't have 30,000 liters of fuel at their disposal. You have to ignore a mountain of compelling testimony to come to the conclusion that Dutch Bat was sitting on that much fuel at that time. Lastly, I want to address the Miletich brief's discussion of the full steam ahead intercept, and this is at page 245, paragraph 569. The brief basically makes the argument that the JEPA plan had been made in Bratunac on the 12th, so it doesn't make sense that General Miletich has any knowledge that's going to help anybody at the time this conversation is held. I just want to point out, the simple fact is, the situation on the ground was materially different on the 17th of July than it was on the 12th. Can't make it any more simple than that. It wasn't the 12th of July anymore. They had encountered fierce fighting. The reality on the ground, as General Miletich knew, had changed significantly in those 5 days. Your Honors, the prosecution is not asking you to convict General Milicic for being the Chief of Operations and Training Administration, or standing in for the Chief of Staff, or being the Deputy Chief of Staff. We are asking you to convict General Milicic because he knowingly participated in that common plan to forcibly remove the Muslim populations from Srebrenica and Žepa. Whether you refer to him as the soul of the army, the nerve center, the hub, the evidence has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that General Radivoj Milicic remained and chose to remain at the heart of that JCE, that joint criminal enterprise to relentlessly seek to remove the Muslim population from the eastern enclaves. And the evidence has shown that he made significant contributions to do so. We ask you to return a guilty verdict for all the crimes with which General Milicic has been charged. Now I want to turn to General Guevara. And again, along the lines of this sort of responding rather than reiterating, I want to clarify a couple of misstatements which I think require addressing. The brief contends that there is no evidence that General Guevara met Mladic in 1991. Pardon me, the brief contends that the first time General Mladic and General Guevara met was in 1991. There's no evidence of that. That's unadorned by any fact or evidence. Page 109, paragraph 38, there's no evidence of the alleged discussions contained in there, as far as I can see. In addition, there are various citations to General Guevara's own statement, which is fine, except they don't support the assertions set forth in the brief. So again, there's facts which are being alleged which have no evidential foundation in this record. I want to turn to two meetings which the brief discusses. I'll just try to correct a little erroneous citation. Paragraph 110, page 110, paragraph 39. These are two reports having to do with meetings between General Smith and various VRS officers on 22 and 25 August 1995. Exhibit numbers P02949 and P02950, respectively. With respect to the 22 August meeting, the Guevara brief suggests that General Guevara was not invited. However, there's no evidence that he was not invited. There's just no record that he was there. In fact, the report of the meeting makes it clear that only local VRS officers attended that meeting with Mladic, and that there was no other VRS general there. With respect to the 25 August meeting, the report of the meeting makes it clear that General Mladic was not accompanied by all his commanders, as the brief states. Rather, it's just Generals Guevara and Tolomir getting down to business with General Smith and General Mladic, as the report records. On page 226, paragraph 329, there's a citation to a newspaper article. As far as I know, that's never been shown. It's never been on any exhibit list. It appears for the first time in the defense brief. Stand to be corrected, but urge the court to give it the evidential value that that deserves. The brief also, I believe, selectively quotes from General Milovanovic's testimony, and this is in the brief at paragraph 135, footnote 291. Suggests that General Guevara was not a member of the Intercollegium, but ignores General Milovanovic's testimony that Mladic would attend with, quote, all his assistants. I want to turn for a few moments to the briefs.
The transcript, line 15. And 14. I think that needs to be corrected, but ignores not General Guevara's testimony, but Milovanovic's testimony. And then, if I heard you correctly, you added that General Mladic would return with all his assistants.
If I misspoke, Mr. President, I apologize.
No, I don't think you misspoke. It's the transcript which is not correct. I mean, that's what you said. You referred to Milovanovic's testimony, yes, to the effect that, according to him, General Mladic always would return with all his assistants.
That the meetings would be attended by all his assistants. Yes, Mr. President.
Right.
Now, I want to turn to the brief's treatment of Colonel Kingori. You saw Colonel Kingori first on the trial video. You saw him out and about on the 12th, on the 13th in Popović, making himself useful, pushing, asking the questions, raising the issues that somebody needed to raise. What's going on over there at that house, that's no good. The person you see doing that is Colonel Kingori. Even in the new Popović video that we just came into possession of, if you watch closely and you see that bread being distributed on the 12th, in addition to Colonel Popović for a while, you see Joseph Kingori. You've read those UNMO reports, Your Honors, written in the midst of that horror, which he experienced from Srebrenica along that flow of terrified refugees up to Srebrenica, and then during that period of 2 days. His courage was challenged. with anonymous snippets from the NIAID report. Yet I had to show him the material which spoke to his courage and the accuracy of his recollection. Is anybody really suggesting that Joseph Kingori wasn't counting those shells? That Colonel Franken didn't tell his soldiers to stop counting because it had gotten over 150 or 200 or whatever it was? Is anybody really suggesting that Joseph Kingori did not see and did not hear and did not accurately report what's in those contemporaneous, desperate, horrified, and ultimately tragic reports? Talking about tears being in their eyes. The shelling argument in the Guevara brief at page 152, paragraph 173, and then at page 153, footnote 65, sets out a portion of the testimony you would have to ignore of the shelling. And it's set forth in our brief, paragraph 283. Footnote 666 to 668. Joseph Kingori left this courtroom telling you, giving you just a sense of what happened there. Now, on the same topic of shelling, I just want to point out that the Guevara brief at pages 163 to 164, paragraph 197, simply ignores Lieutenant Egbert's testimony that he was, in fact, tracked by the shelling. That when he moved from one point to the other, he was followed. Now, let me turn to General Guevara's threats and his pressure on Generals Nicolai and Gobillard. Let there be no mistake about it. General Nicolai remained firm that it was his conversation on 11 July, 1610 hours, with General Guevara, combined with the other threats that Dutch Bat was receiving, which led the United Nations to discontinue its air support that day. Of course, General Guevara knew about those other threats. He had to know. Of course, he knew that Dutch Bat was being targeted. And I won't repeat the arguments in our brief. 6D00207. Guevara's warning to the Drina Corps to treat UNPROFOR decently, touted by the defense, speaks to the opposite. It speaks to his recognition that what he was telling the public and telling UNPROFOR were lies. And I'll spare you the quote from that exhibit. but it's not intended to be a humanitarian gesture towards UNPROFOR. As the document itself states, there are multifarious purposes to treating them that way. Now, Colonel Fortin might have testified that the decision had been made to end the airstrikes by the time General Guevara and General Gobillard spoke. But General Guevara didn't know that. And that's why he starts off that conversation, acknowledging in the conversation that General Gobillard still has close air support available to him at any time. And General Guevara repeats that the decision to use close air support was irrational, and he tones down his threat just a little bit, but his intention is clear. He wants to keep those airplanes out of the air. He doesn't know if the UN is going to put them back up there. So when he speaks to Gobillard again, he stresses again and again that the air support not be continued. And he says, if UN soldiers do not take any actions today, they will be safe. And he characterizes the prior day's air support as a fatal mistake. And it's important to note that Fortin did not have the impression during this conversation that General Guevara was sidelined or marginalized in any respect. And I think the evidence has proven conclusively that this idea that General Guevara was somehow put out to pasture or stuck in a corner somewhere in 1995 simply holds no water. Your Honors, there can be no reasonable doubt that Guevara's threat prompted Generals Guevara and Gobillard to decide to suspend the use of NATO air power to stop the Serb advance on Potočari. When you have the most senior VRS officer, General Guevara, making a statement like that to General Nicolai, on 11 July during that 1610 conversation, it must be taken seriously, and he knows it's going to be taken seriously, and it was. There's no question that that conversation and General Guevara's threats contributed significantly to General Nicolai and General Gobillard's decision to suspend the air support. And what we have in the brief to impeach General Nicolai, I'm afraid, is an absolutely baseless personal attack on him. At page 120, paragraph 8, I quote, "Like many in UNPROFOR, perhaps for sound reasons, but that is not the issue in this trial, he," meaning General Nicolai, "was not keen on the Bosnian Serbs in general, and in its senior military leadership in particular. There is no evidence in this record of any partiality or prejudice on the behalf of General Nicolai. None, other than the words of counsel suggesting it. Yet the brief persists in peddling that at page 180, paragraph 232. That Nicolai claimed that he was not personally under pressure during this period, I think we can attribute to a general's pride and nothing more. But the evidence has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the pressure exerted on him and General Gobiar during those conversations with General Guevara was obvious and enormous, and was a significant contribution to the JCE to remove the Muslim population. The Guevara brief also challenges the intercept of General Guevara and President Karadzic. There are two intercepts which follow General Guevara's conversation with General Nicolai, which you may recall. And in their brief, the Guevara defense spends some time challenging PW 145, trying to impeach his factual knowledge of certain things, calling him conceited. PW 145 clearly testified that his understanding was that General Guevara on the 11th of July was the only senior officer at the main staff. The intercept contains the phrase, "at the Supreme Command." PW 145 testified he wasn't sure what the difference was. Whether he knew the difference between the Supreme Command or the main staff, Pale or Cernarieka, he knew that it was the VRS headquarters, and that's what was important. And he was right. The defense brief accuses him of being conceited for testifying that they didn't write anything down that they weren't sure of. And I won't belabor the intercept heaven we were in for who knows how many months, where operator after operator told you it did us no good to write down something that we couldn't verify 6 ways to Sunday. If we didn't know something, we wouldn't put it down, or we'd indicate that we didn't know it with a question mark. What he testified clearly was the way he identified President Karadzic as being the other participant must have been, as you've heard time and time again, there was a subordinate connecting the call, holding. Oftentimes they would hear that connection being made and somebody would say, hold for the president, hold for President Karadzic, hold for General Mladic, whomever. The evidence has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt through our intercept testimony that that method worked, and it worked well. The references in the Guevara brief at pages 197 and 201 are not helpful. They try to impeach PW 145's conclusion that he was listening to a conversation between General Guevara and President Karadzic by comparing the transcript of that conversation to a transcript of the tape. We have an audio tape of this conversation. And the big point the brief makes is, see, on the tape transcript, there's no identification of Karadzic as being the caller or the participant, and there's only X and Y listed. There's none of this other extraneous information that PW 145 mistakenly put in there. The problem is that transcript is created by the OTP, by one of our language assistants, listening to the tape. So it's not evidence of anything. It's not a MOOP or an ABIH document. It's just our document. And I invite your honors to look at the comparative intercepts that the defense has proffered to you in their attempt to suggest that Guevara in this conversation was actually speaking to somebody else to whom he was referring as president. They use as an example a conversation he has with Professor Popović, whom he refers to as, I believe, vice president, professor, and president. But please look carefully at these conversations. What you'll note, I think, is that these are friendly, conversational, small talk in some places, conversations. The defense would have you believe that the conversation at issue is too cordial to represent the actual fractured relationship between General Guevara and President Karadzic. But when you look at this intercept at issue, it is short, curt, polite, as it should be, and no more. Quite to the contrary of what the defense would have you believe. It further establishes that this call is with President Karadzic, and not somebody with whom he has a more friendly relationship like Professor Popović, where you'll see, again, a much more conversational, talkative, and lengthy intercept. We've heard a lot of testimony about General Guevara's 13 July order to block the passage of the Muslim column. You heard a lot of witnesses try to minimize General Guevara's operational experience, his combat experience. And there's no evidence that when General Guevara issued that order, that anyone, anywhere, said, hang on, this is coming out from General Guevara. This is outside his core competency. Why? He's only ever commanded a platoon. We can't follow this order. He's the morale guy. When that order went out, it was taken as seriously as its subject matter deserved. The Guevara brief would literally have you believe that General Guevara was treated as something of a joke. General Nikolai wasn't laughing, General Gobiard wasn't laughing, and General Jovanovic was not laughing.
Go ahead, Mr. Tarrant. Sorry for the interruption, but we have a small technical problem here.
Not at all, Mr. President. When General Jovanovic received that order, he did not hesitate to implement it, to pass it on, virtually verbatim. And there's nothing unusual about this order going out under General Guerrero's name. General Mladic had to rely on his closest assistants to be able to execute these types of tasks for him. General Milovanovic couldn't do it all by himself, particularly when he wasn't at the command post. And time again, we see the assistant commanders, take Ptolemyr, for example, acting putatively outside their core competencies, providing combat proposals. Take a look at P00187, 13 July, Ptolemyr doing just that, offering combat proposals. P02794, 21 July, the infamous chemical weapons document. It would be more propitious if we bombed the columns of refugees. But in addition to that, you'll see he provides other combat advice. And even the Milicic defense concedes at page 247, paragraph 574, that assistant commanders could be tasked outside their core competencies. P000, one too many zeros, P00186, 29 July. Richard Butler testified, another combat order by Ptolemyr. Again, it should come as no surprise that PW-168 testified that when he was given an order by General Milicic, he understood that General Milicic was giving him that order in the name of General Mladic. This is how this main staff operated. It was their job to give proposals, and sometimes it was their job to be tasked to do something that a general officer should be able to do by virtue of the fact that he is a general officer. I want to address very briefly the Bolshenitsa video. I'm not going to belabor the back and forthing on that. It's all in the brief. We're taken to task in the Guerrero brief for our cross-examination or lack thereof of certain of those witnesses. With a lot of the testimony, it's not inconsistent with what our theory is, that he was there both days. Number one. Number two, the proposition that's being proffered that General Guerrero was there only because he couldn't personally communicate with General Mladic to tell him about the extreme situation in the Krajina is preposterous. We know that General Guerrero was with General Mladic on the 25th at a meeting with General Smith. You've seen the video yourselves, Your Honors. General Guerrero is peeling a label off a beer bottle, chatting up Semyon Dudnik, the Ukrainian commander, talking to Hamdia Torlak, having a jolly time with Vinko Pandurovic, General Kirstich, and General Mladic is there the entire time. And you heard some testimony during the trial about what's been described as a fractious relationship between Generals Guerrero and Mladic. You heard that they fight. You heard that General Guerrero disagreed with General Mladic. You even heard from one witness that General Mladic basically ignored anything that General Guerrero said. I think the evidence in this case is overwhelmingly to the contrary. And I'll just throw out some exhibit numbers for you, Your Honors, to take a look at. P04036. Just a routine convoy request from UNPROFOR, helicopter flights. But General Mladic writes in 3 places on 3 pages, Tosho, Guerrero, your proposals, your attitude. Actively, obviously, seeking their input as his trusted assistants. P02757. General Guerrero's letter to General Karadzic, stating in no uncertain terms who he understands his superior to be and whose orders he singularly followed during the war. Ratko Mladic. P03938, General Mladic's appraisal of General Guerrero, dated October 1995. Admittedly, he's reviewing a period of General Guerrero's work that lasts through 1994, based on his reference to the Lukovac 93 operation, which the evidence shows involved the liberation of Turnovo in 94. Can't explain why that document is dated 1995, but has got a different performance appraisal date. Simply can't explain it. Don't know why. General Guerrero clearly had the ability to disagree with General Mladic. But he could do that and keep his job. I think the evidence in this case has shown, it's based on the anecdotal evidence of General Mladic and his personality, that wouldn't happen if he didn't trust and value that person. We see Guerrero and Mladic side by side again and again. Meetings with Smith in April. Going to see President Karadzic with Mladic, June 1. July and August, meeting with Mladic and Smith. Is there any doubt in anyone's mind that if General Mladic for a minute thought that General Guerrero wasn't significantly contributing to that war effort, he would have been gone? This evidence that you've heard from time to time about disagreements, even fighting, that's evidence of their closeness, Your Honors. It's the people with whom we are most intimate and trusted, with whom we can be the most frank. General Milovanovic specifically rejected defense counsel's proposition that General Guevara had no influence on command. And that's at transcript page 12249. And we see that when Mladic needs to do business, when he's meeting with the Smiths, the Akashis, the Karadžićes, he brings Guevara. He brings Ptolemir, his close assistants. The Guevara brief makes a number of assertions about General Guevara that I want to respond to. It refers to the entire philosophy of the VRS morale sector, which strove for specialist qualifications, good discipline, strict adherence to the rules of engagement, and respect for human rights, was ridiculed, and this diminished the authority of the sector in general and of Milan Guevara in particular. It refers to General Guevara's deeply felt commitment to justice, discipline, and good order. Claims that Milan Guevara was renowned to have been the only good man on the main staff. You even read in the brief that General Guevara never heard about the crimes even after they were committed. That's at page 118, paragraph 3. I want to recall for you, Your Honors, P01334A. It's a 25 July 1995 intercept at 0950. General Guevara was speaking with a friend by the name of Shubara. And Shubara tells Guevara, quote, "I'm calling to tell you to watch out what you're doing over there in Žepa. Not to let it be like in Srebrenica, because there is talk that they slaughtered and rampaged there." And what is General Guevara's response? Quote, "They're lying, man. They're lying." Ever the propagandist, he lies even to this friend, who again says later in the conversation, and I quote, "Yes, that's smart, because they criticized us badly for Srebrenica." General Guevara, obviously up to date on what's happening in Žepa, tells him how exactly they're going to undertake the transportations of the civilians out of the enclave. And his friend to that says, "Yes, that's smart because they criticized us badly for Srebrenica." And Guevara's response, and I quote, "They're just making things up. What else can they do? There's nothing else they can do but lie." Your Honors, General Guevara stood up before you, and he had his chance to express some genuine remorse for these horrendous crimes. Did he even acknowledge that a crime had been committed against the Muslim populations of Srebrenica or Žepa? He said something to the effect, any loss of life is tragic. And then he couldn't help himself and immediately said, but to talk about one side and not the other, that doesn't help matters. When he spoke to you, Your Honors, he couldn't even say the words Srebrenica or Žepa. His contributions to the joint criminal enterprise to forcibly remove the Muslim populations from Srebrenica and Žepa were numerous and they were significant. And we ask that you find him guilty of the crimes with which he has been charged.
For the record, Mr. Van der Puy is now in the courtroom, and I take it that you are going next? Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, Counsel. It is my privilege to appear before you today, Your Honors, to deliver the closing arguments on behalf of the prosecution concerning the accused Ljubiša Beara and Vojin Popović. I will endeavor to limit my submissions to the evidence that directly links these accused to the crimes with which they've been charged under the indictment, and except to briefly underscore and highlight some of the overwhelming evidence against Mr. Beara and Mr. Popović. As I will address each in turn, I will try to the greatest extent possible to avoid restating the arguments that are already set out in the prosecution's extensive trial brief. Between Mr. Beara and Mr. Popović, they have challenged almost every aspect of the indictment, including aspects of the crime base itself, ranging from the number of dead to their identity as Muslims. In the case of Mr. Beara, besides basically acknowledging his position as Chief of Security of the main staff of the VRS, the defense essentially denies the entire case against the accused, and Mr. Popović is only slightly less contentious. They have every right to do so, and it is our burden, clearly, to prove the charges in the indictment beyond a reasonable doubt. And we accept that burden, Your Honors, and we're confident that the evidence in this case absolutely proves the guilt of Mr. Beara and Mr. Popović of the charged offenses beyond any reasonable doubt. The Beara defense brief at paragraph 42 basically states that the prosecution has, among other things, manipulated facts out of context in the presentation of this case. And while leveling these types of allegations in its final submissions is, in my view, of questionable value, I just want to reiterate a couple of things. First, that we fully rely and we stand on the record of these proceedings. We're entirely confident that the trial chamber's ability to independently review, scrutinize, and to fairly deliberate and consider the established facts just as they are in the record. And we have full confidence in the strength of the case that has been presented against these accused. The facts establishing Mr. Beara, and for that matter, Mr. Popović's culpability, and that warrant their conviction of the charged offenses in this case speak loudly, and they speak clearly. Most importantly, Your Honors, they speak for themselves. The defense brief, that is Mr. Beara's brief, is replete with arguments to the effect that Beara did not know and was not aware of the crimes that were being perpetrated. I'm quoting from paragraph 494. And this is predicated predominantly on two defenses, and they're related. One is an alibi defense. As you are aware, Mr. Beara asserts that he was in Belgrade between 13 and 16 July 1995. And the second is what I would call an ID defense, and that is that he asserts that the identification evidence in this case against him is unproven because it is unreliable or even contrived. It seems to suggest that he may have been framed. The alibi defense that's put forward in Mr. Beara's direct case fails. And it fails for two fundamental reasons, Your Honors. First, it is intrinsically unreliable and it is incredible. The second is that even if it were not so, the evidence in this case, the intercept evidence, the documentary evidence, the eyewitness evidence, all considered together, categorically disproves the alibi and establishes Mr. Beara's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As you know, the Beara defense called 3 alibi witnesses for this period. They called Mira Cekic, who was a friend of the Beara family, Svetlana Gavrilović, also a friend of the family, and Milan Kirkez, a friend of Mr. Beara's son, Branko Beara, and they've been friends since the 7th grade before he testified. The trial chamber obviously had an opportunity to see and to hear each of these witnesses attest to their respective recollections and their knowledge of the events to which they testified. I won't go through the alibi extensively because it is, albeit limitedly, covered in the prosecution's brief. But there are some points in that alibi testimony that I would like to highlight for the trial chamber, because I think it underscores just how utterly unbelievable and untenable that alibi defense really was. Svetlana Gavrilović testified that she met Mr. Beara and his wife at the home of Mira Cekic on 14 July. She claimed, among other things, that she could remember details, if you recall, from a 1993 birthday party for Mr. Beara, some 15 years before she actually testified in this case. And she testified without any priming, without anything to jog her memory, without any prompting, or frankly, without any real good reason for her to be able to recall the details that she related to this trial chamber. But she testified in a feat that can only be considered unbelievable and really astonishing. She was able to recall from this 1993 birthday party how Mr. Beara was dressed. She testified that he had a t-shirt on, that it was a white t-shirt, that it had a logo on it, that it was a crew neck and not a V-neck t-shirt, She testified that he had on casual pants, and they were either jeans or some other kind of pants. She even testified to what he was wearing on his feet. She testified that he had slippers on. And oh yes, she was able to tell us what color they were. She said that they were dark blue. She remembered that from 1993. Then she testified about a 1995 birthday party. And she gave the same level of detail with respect to the 1995 birthday party as well. She was able to tell us on that occasion what kind of shoes he was wearing or what color shoes he was wearing, and told us that they were black shoes on that occasion, in addition to the other details concerning the alibi. She told you about the time that Mr. Bayara came over to her place to fix her iron. And she remembered what he had on then also. On that occasion, he came and she said that he was wearing a navy coat. He took off the coat, and oh yes, she could remember what he was wearing under the coat. And on that occasion, he had on a shirt with a sweater, and she could remember that. When it came to the more recent events, such as when it was that she actually met with the defense investigator, Mr. Stanich, concerning her testimony, she gave the following answers to the following questions, if I could just read that in. And that's at transcript 24781, it's lines 9 through 20. The question is put to her by Mr. McCloskey. So a couple of months ago, maybe March or April, Mr. Stanich comes up to you and asks you about this important topic. You know that Mr. Bayara is in The Hague. You know about genocide and mass murder. But you cannot tell me the date of this, the date he contacted you, Mr. Stanich. You can't even tell me the month. No, I can't. I really can't. When she's pressed, she says, no, I can't. I can't give you the date. I can't remember. I don't know the date. Do you know the month? Well, it may have been April, in the month of April, March or April, when I met Mr. Stanich, thereabouts. What day? I don't know. I really don't know. I did not consider this date worth retaining, remembering at all. That's about the only believable thing that she said during the course of her testimony. Indeed, why would anybody remember the level of details that she testified concerning what Mr. Bayara wore in 1993, or what he wore in 1995, or what he wore when he came to fix her iron? Why would anybody consider that worth retaining? The fact is, really, nobody would. She made it up because she knew that it couldn't be checked. She made it up because she knew that it couldn't be verified. And the one thing that she wasn't sure that could be verified, she had no recollection of. And it was the most recent event relative to Mr. Bayara prior to her testimony. The trial chamber should reject this testimony. It is not worthy of your consideration in respect of evaluating the charges against Mr. Bayara. Milan Kirkes testified. And there was a young man who was a good friend of Mr. Bayara's son. He was working, he was charming, and he actually seemed that he was being genuine with the trial chamber when he testified. And he testified about his trip to Montenegro with his friends, and we showed photographs, and he talked about how his friends had a good time and they were chasing girls, I think. He testified that he went to the Bayara home on 14 July. He saw Mr. Bayara there. Branco told him that it was Mr. Bayara's birthday, and according to Mr. Kirkes, they ended up leaving the next day. He said they took a bus and went down to Petrovac. Of course, there are infirmities in his story as well. You may recall that Mr. Kirkes testified that he came back from Petrovac after exactly 2 weeks. He said it was a Saturday, exactly 2 weeks. That's in the transcript of 24941, 23 through 24. And he said he wanted to come back to have a rest and start his practice the next day, Monday. He later said, and I just want to read from the transcript. This is at transcript page 24955 through 24956. Question. All right. When you got back from your vacation, you went to your training, you said, right? That is handball training. Answer. We arrived at the weekend. I took a day rest. Then my coach, Pera Lazarevic, an Olympian, had the same system. He started preparations on the 1st of September. Since the 1st of September was a weekend, we started on Monday. There was a competition to be held soon, and we started our preparations on the first Monday after the 1st of September. Okay. Did you tell Mr. Stojic and Mr. Stanic that your coach's name was Pera Lazarevic? Did you tell them that? Answer, I did. Question. And you told them that you started on the 1st of September, your training. You told them that too. Answer, the 1st of August. Question, the 1st of August? Answer, yes, I did. Sounded reasonable, sounded confident. In fact, it was incorrect, and it was a deceit. The 1st of August, as he corrected it, did not fall on a weekend, as he said. It did not fall on a Saturday. It did not fall on a Sunday. And for that matter, it didn't fall on a Monday either. The 1st of August fell exactly 3 weeks after the fall of Srebrenica, the 11th of July. That was a Tuesday. Why is this significant? It's significant because Mr. Kirkes's story about when it is that he got back and what it is he did in order to anchor the time that he was gone was related to the time that his practice started. He told us that his practice started on a Monday because the 1st of the month, he said September, but I think he meant August, fell on a weekend. It didn't. And if he started his practice the 1st Monday after the 1st of August, that was the 7th of August. And if that's when he started his practice, then he couldn't have left when he said he left. And if he did leave when he said he left, then he's got his times completely screwed up, and he's an unreliable witness in terms of establishing the alibi that's been proffered by the defense in this case. It's not just that he's wrong about the date, Your Honor. Is that he's wrong about the entire story that relates to the date. He gave an actual explanation as to why it is he knew that it was that Monday. He knew that it was Monday because the 1st was on the weekend, and in fact, it wasn't. So the whole recollection and the basis of his recollection is contrived. Ironically, Mr. Kirkes said that he believed that he was interviewed by the defense investigator in this case because, among his friends, he best recalled the events concerning the vacation, if you can recall that. In fact, he couldn't remember the name of the address of the place that they stayed. By the time he testified in this case, he'd already been there 3 times. He'd been there twice. He'd been there once before 1995, then again in 1995, according to his testimony, and then again in 1996. And when he testified here, couldn't remember the address of the place. He couldn't remember the name of the street that it was on. He couldn't remember the name of the proprietor or the person through whom he made the booking in this case. He couldn't remember the date or the day of the week that Mr. Steinich called him to meet prior to his testimony. But he claimed that he could remember the circumstances surrounding their vacation better than Branko Beara. And you remember the reason why Branko Beara, according to Mr. Kirkes, was able to go on this vacation to begin with was because his father came home for his birthday and his father gave him some money, and that's how it was able to occur. Branko Beara's ability to go on this vacation with his friend, according to Kirkes, was entirely linked and connected to his father's birthday. I just want to read to you from the transcript a little bit. And this is on transcript 24946, pages 8 through 20. I'm sorry, lines 8 through 20. Question. Well, you talked to him about this vacation, right? Answer. With Branko? Question. Yes. As I said, from time to time, we go back to that vacation, but after I spoke with the attorney, we didn't discuss that particularly. For some reason of his, he noticed that I can recall many details. He probably gave my phone number to the attorney, and in turn, he called me. Having discussed this with him, what kinds of details do you remember that he doesn't? Answer. For example, the date when we left. He couldn't recall that. Question. He doesn't remember the date that you left? Answer. He doesn't. I'm sure you remember, as I've described, this whole story about how it is that Branko was able to go. And they had discussed this trip not long before Mr. Kirkes testified. Kirkes immediately realized how implausible this had to be. Because if the only reason that Branko Beara was able to go on this vacation was because his father was home to give him money, and they discussed this only a couple of months before he testified, it is inconceivable that he wouldn't remember how it is that he ended up going on that vacation. And that answer would make no sense whatsoever. It would undermine completely his testimony and undermine completely the accuracy with which he purported to give it. So what did he do? He changed his answer. Right on the spot, and I know that that wasn't lost in the trial chamber. The Beara defense has also advanced the proposition that the alibi is corroborated by entries in Bob Djurdjevic's diary concerning Miloš Tomović. They posit that it is logical to conclude that Tomović would have driven Beara to Belgrade on that morning when he was stopped together with Djurdjevic on 13 July by military police. Now, I don't know about the logic of making that conclusion, but I don't see that there's evidence in the record that Tomović drove Mr. Beara to Belgrade. There's just no hard evidence of that in the record. I would submit to the trial chamber, as I've said, that the alibi evidence presented as to Mr. Beara fails because it is not reliable, it fails because it's not credible, and most importantly, it fails because it simply does not reflect the truth about where Mr. Beara was and what he was doing between 13 and 16 July 1995. The Beara defense also posits the notion of an unreliable identification in the alternative. In their brief, the defense argued that the identification evidence against Mr. Beara is the product of either erroneous processes or factors which have tainted its accuracy and reliability. They also argue that certain identifying witnesses deliberately misidentified or implicated Mr. Beara in order to serve their own ulterior motives and to diminish their own criminal responsibility in this case. According to paragraphs 43 and 133 through 137 of the defense brief, these witnesses, quote, mischaracterized, distorted, and manipulated the evidence to avoid indictment. In short, the suggestion is that Mr. Beara was scapegoated or even framed in respect of the charges leveled against him in this case. Some 14 witnesses identified Mr. Beara in and around the Zvornik and Bratunac areas in Nova Kasaba during the period that was claimed by in his alibi. Over the period of 13 and 14 July, about 10 witnesses identify him. This evidence cannot be compartmentalized or viewed in insular or disjointed fragments. It really has to be viewed in the context of the whole. It has to be viewed in light of the other evidence in this case. And viewed in this light, the truth about Mr. Beara's whereabouts during the critical period set out in the indictment is plain and is evident in the trial record. That evidence is found in the documentary evidence in this case, the intercept evidence in this case, and of course the testimonial record. And you've heard and you've seen these identifying witnesses, and you've had the opportunity to consider their evidence in light of all the other compelling evidence in this case. The defense expert, Mr. Wagenaar, did not consider that other evidence. And the conclusions he contained in his report, as well as in his testimony, painfully reflect that. You may recall that when he was confronted, he conceded that he did not review the statements of witnesses other than the 12 that were selected by the defense. He did not realize that Mr. Beara had appeared on wanted posters in determining whether or not it was appropriate to place certain witnesses in a lineup. He obviously didn't consider that in suggesting the propriety of conducting these identification tests, either photo arrays or lineups. You recall that he testified how he was unable to discover any photos where Mr. Beara was not wearing glasses because that was relevant to a particular identification, and again affecting his judgment as to the propriety of implementing identification procedures. He was confronted with P03695, which was an internet printout showing Mr. Beara without glasses in an image from 2004. The one thing he said that was significant, and I submit that the trial chamber should countenance, is that names are basically easier to remember than faces. You can refresh your recollection of a name by repeating a story much easier than you can a face. He noted that while it may be difficult at times to recall a face with respect to a name, there's no reason why the memory should fail. He indicated also that the same goes for someone who's familiar to the identifying party. And I just want to briefly remind the court of who some of these identifying witnesses are and the context in which they identified and implicated Mr. Beara in these events. Zlatan Celanovic is Bratunac's legal officer who on 10 or 11 July puts Beara in front of the Bratunats headquarters together with Mr. Popović.
Kindly slow down for the sake of the interpreters who don't have the text you're reading out. Thank you.
On the evening of 13 July, after 2100 hours, sometime, Jovanović met Beara and discussed with him the large number of prisoners then in Bratunats. He was with Mr. Beara as he toured Bratunats, surveying the security situation concerning the Muslim men and boys who were held on buses throughout the town. Remarkably, while the defense assert that this never happened, they also argue that it shows that Beara lacked genocidal intent because he talked about transferring prisoners to Kladin. Don't think those two things can coexist. By the time Mr. Beara discussed transportation with Jovanović, he had already met with Momir Nikolić at the center of town, and he already had ordered him to go and see Drago Nikolić at the Zvornik Brigade in order to provide him with details concerning the thousands of prisoners to be sent to Zvornik and to be killed there. Telling Jovanović the prisoners were going to Kladin, rather than showing a lack of intent, shows cunning and it shows manipulation. It's the same thing you see on a 13 July intercept, where it is claimed that Beara is sending transportation to take the prisoners to Popović. Beara never arranged or carried out any such transportation. Never happened. And what you have here is not evidence of that's exculpatory. You have evidence of a pretext. And what you have evidence of is intent. As the chief of security of the VRS main staff, it makes perfect sense that Mr. Beara met with Jovanović concerning the prisoners. Jovanović was directly involved in those matters, and indeed you may recall that he was involved with one particular prisoner, Reshid Sinanović, who was the former head of the police station in Bratunats. And you know that Reshid Sinanović, who was in the custody of the VRS, was never seen again. Jovanović knew Beara. He described him, and there's really no reasonable doubt as to the veracity of his testimony. PW 161 also was called over to the SDS offices in Bratunats on the evening of 13 July. And there, Mr. Beara asked him about the availability of certain machinery and manpower. He told PW 161 that it was needed because there were a lot of dead that needed to be buried. And PW 161 later returned to the SDS offices that night. Mr. Beara directed him to go to a location where a grave was to be dug. And the next day, after some trouble getting the grave dug, he assured PW 161 that a backhoe excavator would be provided in order to assist in carrying out the job of burying the victims of the Kravica warehouse massacre. PW 162 met Mr. Beara on the morning of 14 July at the SDS offices at around 9:30 in the morning. Importantly, Mr. Beara introduced himself by name. even according to the defense witness, Mr. Alhenar, there's no reason why his recollection of the name should fail. On that occasion, there were two other VRS officers with Mr. Bayara who engaged PW-162 to obtain certain construction equipment from the brickworks factory, which included a loader. There's evidence in this case that even co-accused Lubisha Yubomir Borovchinin identified Mr. Bayara. On 12 July, or thereabout, he indicated that he saw Mr. Bayara with Miroslav Derenic in the center of Bratunac, discussing the Muslim column moving towards Zvornik. That's Exhibit P02852, pages 76 through 77. 13 July, he saw Mr. Bayara at the Bratunac headquarters arguing with Miroslav Derenic sometime after 8 p.m. on 13 July. And according to Mr. Borovchinin, Bayara was insistent that all the captured be brought to Bratunac, and Derenic was adamantly against it. You have in the record the testimony of Mr. Derenic, who says that on 13 July, Mr. Bayara tells him he's there to kill the prisoners. And on 14 July, he goes to the Siliani Brickworks factory, where he confronts Bayara, tells him not to kill anybody. And this follows Mr. Bayara's meeting with PW-162, where he is galvanizing this engineering equipment and is told, or rather the other officers are told, that there may be equipment available for them at the Brickworks factory. You have the testimony of Momir Nikolic.
Anytime it's convenient for you, it's break time.
I'm just about to segue. You have that testimony. That is the testimony of Momir Nikolic. That you received recently, and I'm sure you recall it very well. And we're not asking you to make anything more out of this testimony than you can find is reasonably corroborated by the evidence in this case. I would submit, however, that there is plenty of corroboration. I think now we can break.
$25 minutes, thank you.
All rise for you, Vuluvi.